Thank you for joining our webinar, Brand and Anti-Fraud Enforcement Strategies. My name is Brian Costello, Marketing Manager for MarkMonitor, and I'm excited to be joined by my colleagues, Stefanie Ellis, Portfolio Marketing Manager, and Dustin Richards, Brand Operations Manager, both at MarkMonitor. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Stefanie and Dustin to our presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Dustin and I today. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about why we are addressing brand and anti-fraud enforcement strategies now. Why now? MarkMonitor has been offering brand protection and anti-fraud strategies for over 15 years at this point. So why is it important to delineate between enforcement strategies now? We've increasingly noticed that we're helping to educate our clients more on what are brand infringements versus phishing fraud incidents. In general, the term fraudulent is used very broadly and often refers to any kind of intellectual property misuse. At MarkMonitor, we tend to define fraud more narrowly in relation to phishing fraud or criminally fraudulent activity. With employee spear phishing or BEC scams, those are business email compromise scams, becoming so prevalent and targeting organizations who have really never dealt with cybercrime before, we're definitely seeing more questions in general coming up between the differences between trademark and copyright infringement versus phishing fraud or malicious infringement. So today we wanted to take this opportunity to discuss how to determine intent of an infringement and the best enforcement strategies based on intent. We have an absolute ton of examples to walk you through today to help illustrate the differences between those enforcement types. So first, though, I think let's go ahead and establish the threat. This diagram is going to give a good representation of the impact of doing business online. Really, brick-and-mortar establishments must contend with physical security, but in the online world, threats are more prevalent and insidious. Misuse of intellectual property are more malicious threats, or more malicious threats can impact an organization's reputation through changing public perception. This can lead to higher operating costs to fight those threats and, of course, lost revenue. So proactively creating detection and enforcement options to tackle these threats really can reduce reputational impact. And that's really what we want to talk about today, is how to kind of focus your efforts, determine intent, and make sure that you are effectively enforcing on what is targeting your brands. So let's dive a little deeper and define these brands. I'm going to throw it to Dustin and ask him to first kind of talk us through what's considered a brand infringement.
Okay, so an infringement is actually using a company's trademark. It could perhaps be a logo, it could be their reputation, it could also be just the name of the company to drive traffic to their site or boost their own business. So when an infringement occurs, we don't typically see that they're trying to steal money or data from the trademark owner. What they are doing is they're trying to get gain by using the goodwill that the trademark owner has built. Most often infringements are of a civil nature, not of a criminal nature. So Stefanie, how would you define malicious?
Well, malicious is simply any misuse of an organization's name, logo, look and feel, and reputation, but with the intent to gain money or data through online trickery of some sort. The intent is malicious, and the action is usually criminal. So let's define those a little bit further. Dustin, start us off with the list of brand infringements, or with the description of brand infringements.
Okay, so when we're talking about brand infringement, what we're really talking about is the unauthorized use of intellectual property. WIPO has defined intellectual property as referring to creations of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs and symbols, names and images used in commerce. So what that means is the logo. It could mean the look and feel, potentially the online presence, etc. So when we see intellectual property on a site or domain name, we really need to determine what their intent and purpose is. Is it possible they could be impersonating a company, or are they affiliated? Are they trying to drive traffic away from that legitimate site or claim an affiliation to boost their business? If we determine the intent is unauthorized, it simply means that the infringer wants that company's traffic by making users believe that they're on the company's site or redirecting legitimate traffic elsewhere. The impact of this, though, is a loss of traffic to the legitimate site with the potential loss of revenue. And in a lot of cases, brand reputation is impacted as well. And some sites look exactly like the legitimate site. You can imagine that it causes a lot of confusion for consumers and really can hurt a company's hard-earned reputation.
Right. And the same can be said of phishing fraud. In fact, it's primarily the same in that it's also the unauthorized use of intellectual property. However, the twist for phishing fraud is the intent. The intent is to illegally obtain money or data. Essentially, in phishing fraud, the threat actor or fraudster or bad guy or whatever you choose to call them will impersonate a brand through social engineering tactics to steal credentials from unsuspecting customers of that targeted organization for monetary gain. Sometimes their intent is to steal intellectual property for resale. Sometimes they're impersonating the brand to deliver malware, and some are just email-based scams misusing the brand name. So the impact differs slightly from brand in that there are real financial losses due to customer victims, plus the support needed to track the compromised accounts, to notify and work with customers on their accounts, and often it results in not just brand confusion, but also brand distrust, which is a little bit different than just brand confusion on the brand side. So let's define these threats a little bit more clearly, I think. Dustin, in your role as manager of brand operations, you manage the teams of analysts that MarkMonitor utilizes to analyze and identify brand infringing threats. Can you define the terminology the team uses in their analysis?
Sure. So on the brand side, we actually see quite a few different types of infringements. Each of these uses different methods to drive traffic. So on this slide, you'll see that we have listed a few of the most common methods. A lot of these can come down to traffic diversion due to some kind of false affiliation with a brand. Some of these methods are even more egregious than others. The more egregious sites will really confuse a consumer and make them believe they're legitimately on the trademark owner's site or an affiliated site. We're going to walk you through several examples in a moment here. Steph, can you define the phishing fraud threats?
Yeah, of course. So on the fraud side, the primary focus of phishing is brand impersonation. Brand impersonation for the purpose of tricking consumers is still the most common form of stealing user credentials. Vishing is done over the phone. That's vishing with a V, and sadly is generally targeting older individuals because, especially in America, us Gen Xers and millennials have learned to not answer our phones to unrecognized phone numbers. So for us, smishing and SMS text messaging is becoming more common. And on those messages, when you get them on your smartphone, they're just generally asking you to dial a number, which would result in a phishing attack, or more commonly, click on a link on your smartphone to go on a website. So distribution of malware is in the brand name is common, and then the newest form of phishing fraud that we're really seeing taking over in a lot of ways is what we call BEC scams or EAC scams. That stands for business email compromise or email account compromise. It's often called employee spear phishing as well. The hardest part of those types of attacks is that it's generally one email to one person, usually an employee of an organization, and impersonating an executive or a business partner of some sort. Now, email is still the primary distribution channel for phishing attacks. Though phishing and smishing happen commonly, their detectable volumes still don't compare to phishing emails. So Dustin, I would imagine, though, that there's a wide range of channels that brand infringements cover versus phishing, which is largely targeted on email.
Absolutely, Stefanie. There's actually many different formats in which we see infringements. I don't think there's anywhere on the internet you can go that doesn't have an infringement problem. Few platforms are immune to infringing content. For example, you can see there's a Facebook post potentially, or the page. You could also have a Twitter handle or a tweet, potentially organic listings as well, or even website content. Each of these platforms can be used by infringers in a large way. So you have to really know what's legitimate, but that's a real challenge. So it's very important for an individual to know what to look for on a page. Let's look at some of the examples of some infringing sites and why infringers use these tactics. So on this page, or first of all, on each of these slides that have examples, you'll see the URL listed at the bottom. Anytime you see the word brand in red, this means we've removed the trademarks from the URL. We've also obfuscated any trademark for privacy reasons. So when a site has content solely in the form of advertising links and they use the brand and the domain, we call that site a pay-per-click site. In many cases, a domain registrant has contracted with an advertiser to place these links on their site. So each time any of these links are clicked, the registrant and advertiser is paid a fee per click. Now, on this page, the infringer uses a trademark and the domain name to monetize on that trademark. Each of the links that you see on there, the hospital careers, healthcare careers, etc., will most often direct you to a legitimate site. However, with each click, the domain owner will receive a certain amount of money from the advertiser. Sites like this often have a notice that the domain is for sale, and that also could bring in additional revenue if the domain name is a strong enough domain name. These sites are fun. Perhaps during your adventures on the internet, you have come across a site that is full of gibberish and makes no sense. It might have random pictures and words throughout the site. There are often no rhyme or reason to how the site's put together. We refer to these sites as keyword stuffing or keyword hijacking. Now, these sites use clients' trademark terms or keywords throughout the site and the content to drive traffic. The domain name makes no difference in these situations because a lot of these sites are hacked from a legitimate site and the keywords are placed or stuffed in the site. You might search through the words and on the site and you'll see quite a different variety of brands represented. So the intent of a keyword stuffing site is to drive traffic to this site in order to improve rankings or various search engines, or on various search engines. Once a desired result is achieved, they could redirect the traffic to a legitimate site. They are taking advantage of the goodwill of a trademark owner by driving traffic to a site which is not affiliated in any way. It could also redirect you to a malicious site. Depending on the ISP, content on these types of sites is typically easy to remove. All right, so this site is a site claiming to review a product. Now, these sites can be a little tricky because of the freedom of speech situation. Now, if it's a legitimate review site, we typically suggest the client not enforce on them because of the damaging effects enforcing can have. Most often, we would let the client know about this site and we would monitor it for content. We could consider monitoring the site as informational only and not one we would enforce on. So copyrighted materials also, these are abundant throughout the internet. You'll see them all over. What this is, there are many different sites that offer material for free, also for a fee. This site is offering a manual for download. The material presented in this manual actually wasn't authorized to publish on the internet. So by offering these free materials, it's more likely a consumer will pay for something more if they like what is presented. Also, at times, only a part of the material is presented, and the consumer has to pay for the entire version if they wish to view the entire work. All right, so an impersonation site or copycat site. These copy the brand owner's site in many ways. The domain might also be very similar to the legitimate site. These sites are really good at confusing consumers. Phishing attempts often use impersonation sites as a front to their operation. However, in this situation, this brings up a lot of questions. At first glance, this site might be considered a phishing site due to the login links on the left-hand side. But when we check those links, they don't work. So the next thought is it could be an affiliate. However, many of the images do not work either, and the use of the trademark at the top of the page is not the same as the client's trademark. Even the name on the site does not match the name in the domain registration, as you can see on the right-hand side. With that being said, we did a whois lookup on the domain and made the connection that both this site as well as our client's site were registered around the same time by the same registrar. There is a lot of legitimate information and links to the client site on this site that would make us believe that it's affiliated in some way, but we would have to send this to the client to have them verify it.
So Dustin, can I ask a question on that? So in a situation like this, when the analysts are reviewing this, they would, since they can't determine affiliation, then log this and review it with the customer. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. All right, so this site, false association. What false association or questionable affiliation is that it's also called false affiliation or brand confusion. It's a site that uses a trademark in a way that makes the consumer think that the site is a partner of the trademark owner. These come in a large variety of sites. So we've seen independent hotels use a logo and brand of a large hotel chain claiming they were affiliated, when in reality, all they wanted to do was use the logo and brand to draw traffic to their site. False association can happen, though, when a site uses a similar look to the brand owner's site to confuse a consumer into thinking that it's a legitimate site. So we can't tell what's going on this site. We have tested the username and password, and it's not accepting fake credentials, which tells us that it's most likely not malicious. In this case, though, they're offering free reports, or offering reports, actually, from our client. So they really need to go back to our client to determine if this is an affiliate or not. If they say yes, then we will mark this as benign. But if the client says no, we would enforce on it as a false affiliation site. All right, this is a lead generator site. They make you believe that you're on the affiliated site when you click on the link. It takes you to a page that's not affiliated with the trademark owner. The link is that spot that says get a free quote. This most often happens with financial or insurance companies. You land on a page that you believe gives legitimate links to an affiliated site, but many times you won't know if the site you land on is actually affiliated or not, because it could be the competitor of the trademark owner, potentially a malicious site. The key to this site is the ad that says get a free quote. The domain itself is getusbestquotes.com, and the URL includes an insurance company trademark, which could make a user believe they were on a legitimate loan lead site. Clicking on the link, get a free quote, would take you to the legitimate insurer website, or a legitimate insurer website, but not the site of the trademark owner. So the registrant of this loan lead generator site could receive money for referring anyone who clicks on the link, thus monetizing on the infringing URL. So if you take a closer look at this site also, and you'll see that the paragraphs are written, they're meaningless, they're just gibberish also. Some might say this is a keyword stuffing site. However, with the presence of that link, the get a free quote link, it's become a loan lead generator site. These enforcement techniques would be the same, however, for a loan lead generator site or a keyword stuffing site.
Well, I'm going to jump in there and talk a little bit about how these can be confused with phishing. So oftentimes when you click on that get a free quote link, it actually takes you to a page that, again, is another insurer page, or a payday loan is a very common loan lead generator tactic as well. Get a payday loan from this, and it uses a legitimate organization to draw you in. And then the page is asking for a bunch of personal information because you're applying for a loan. So obviously applying for a loan, you supply a lot of personal information. Oftentimes there's confusion about whether that's a phishing site or if it's a brand infringement. And even though it is asking for a lot of information, and even though that site usually does not have security certificate associated with it, oftentimes it is a legitimate site in that when you submit it, you do get sent out and you do get a payday loan. But because there's no security certificate on the page and there's no requirement that these loan generator sites actually have secure transmissions, you can't guarantee that the data that you're submitting isn't being sniffed out and being shared elsewhere. So I would be really careful about this in terms of having anything like this associated with your brand name. It's not phishing, it is a brand infringement. However, I would call it sketchy. So just wanted to jump in and give that perspective from a fraud perspective.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Let's go to the next one.
All right, so this is a park site. It's also known as cyber squatting. And that's when a person registers a domain using the full trademark and doesn't add any content but parks the page for later use or to list it for sale. Typo squatting is also another type of parked page, but instead of using the correct spelling of a trademark, you would see a slight misspelling, such as using a 0 for an O in the domain. So now as you look at this page, you actually can see that there is no registrant-generated content on it. The trademark is in the domain, which makes it a potential infringement. Park sites do not always look the same, but they do have the similar features to them. Now, what makes a park site different than a pay-per-click site is the lack of advertising links. You'll notice that there's a link that says, would you like to buy this domain? That link will take you to an auction site or a service to acquire the domain. This is one way an infringer can monetize on this park domain. Infringers will also often hold on to domains for future use or sale, which can make them even more money. Also, at times when we enforce on these, it's not uncommon to have a response from the registrant saying the site is for sale. Now, Steph, that was actually a lot of information. Do you want to take us through some of the phishing examples?
Yeah, I've been waiting for you to finish. So, yeah, let's start with some phish targeting services-based companies. Now, that term is really broad, services, and it really does encapsulate the most heavily traditionally phished organizations. It's going to be your financials, retails, SaaS-based companies, travel and hospitality, et cetera. In these examples, we have a telecommunications company, a money transfer company, a VRBO service or vacation rentals, and a logistics company. All are phished for credentials in these examples, but you'll see some phishing sites that want more than just credentials in some of the next examples. So I want to point out one more thing. On all of these examples, we have included the URL where the phishing site was found. In a lot of phishing sites, the brand is not part of the domain name and often isn't part of the URL at all. It's very common for phishing sites to be hosted on legitimate websites that have a vulnerability, allowing a threat actor to use the legal domain to host phishing content. The configuration of phishing sites and where they are hosted is really important to best practices on enforcement. We'll discuss that further, but first let's look at a few more examples. So the next one up is payment services. Both of these are targeting companies that provide payment services in some way, shape, or form, among other services. One is asking for a username and password, and then the one on the right is asking for full name, date of birth, address, and phone number. So obviously looking for a lot more information. And again, if you look at the URLs, no mention of the brand names in either one of those URLs. In fact, the one on the right is on a completely different domain name that really has nothing to do with it. These are credit card examples. Both of these are targeting well-known credit card providers. I'm sure our obfuscation techniques make this impossible to figure out, and so I don't stress out our attorney. I will say that all of the examples that we have included here in the phishing realm, we have found through open source data and are completely publicly accessible rather than pulled from any of our proprietary customer or partner feeds, just so you know. And in both examples, the intent is to access the account by stealing usernames and passwords. Note that the brand is in the URL of one, but not the domain name, and then not included at all in the URL of the other site. So I've got a couple examples here of commonly phished social media platforms. The first is asking for email or phone number to get past challenges from logging into the platform from an unrecognized device. That's the one on the left. The other is in Arabic, and I'll admit that I'm not sure what the fields are actually asking for. We do have support personnel that can read Arabic, but I'm not one of them. And again, in the second example, note that the brand is only mentioned in the subdomain of the URL rather than in the domain. Cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency companies are becoming really prevalent in both in our society and in our economies. As of this writing, and this is a couple of days ago, it's actually already changed, there were 1,969 cryptocurrency companies listed on CoinMarketCap, and that's 25 more than when I looked last week. And that's not to mention the exchanges and the different markets these currencies actually transact across. Phishers are really starting to hit cryptocurrencies because when they can access someone else's wallet, their online wallet, there's nothing stopping them from moving that money around. In some cases, the phishing intent is for logins. However, if we look at this next example, then we'll see that you can see the image at the bottom of the page that they're asking for things that are not commonly requested for traditional phishing sites. This is asking for private keys, mnemonic phrases, specific file info to identify the user's online wallet. And then the image at the top I thought was just funny. It's from the legitimate company's website. I thought it was a very polite way of asking a user not to fall for a phishing scam. Please and thank you. So kind of the last example I have here is really BEC scams. Those are those business email compromise or email account compromise scams I mentioned earlier, again, often called employee spear phishing attempts. They're really very prevalent, and they're increasing globally, and it's because they're so successful. It's one email to one person, so detection is limited externally. And the threat actor is really counting on that human element to not look at the sending domain. We all use email every day, but I question this. How often do we double check where every individual email is actually coming from? In these examples, they're all impersonating a CEO. The first on the left is asking in broken English, if you notice, if the employee is available, but note the subject line says, quote unquote, wiring instructions. So we can see that the intent is to request a wire transfer. In looking at the email headers below that, you can see that the CEO's email was spoofed, and the real address sending the email was from a cckgp.com address, and the reply to is an outlook.com address. Neither of these is relevant to the targeted organization. Now, on the second example on the right is also about wire transfers. However, look at the sending email address. I would like to believe that most of us would catch that our CEO wasn't emailing us from CEO Executive Officer at AOL. I'm hoping. So what does that mean? We've just gone through a ton of examples, both infringing with the traffic diversion or brand confusion intent, and malicious phishing examples with the intent to defraud. So let's talk about the enforcement process and then why determining intent is so important. Now, Dustin, on the brand side, how does your team go through and determine intent?
Well, when we look at a site, we go through various steps to determine if there's an infringement. So the first thing we do is we take a general look and notice various things. So is there a logo displayed? Is the brand in the domain, or are they using the brand keyword in the site somehow? Is there a copyrighted image on the site? So if yes, we go to the next step, which would then be to ask if the site's affiliated. If the client verifies that the site's not an affiliate, we would then look at the appropriate enforcement method. That could be a letter to the registrant or even possibly to the ISP, depending on the infringement type. If we determine the intent is to steal money or data, well, that's malicious. And Stefanie, will you walk us through those steps?
Right, yeah. On the fraud side, we're specifically looking for intent to steal data, and if we can determine that, then an ISP can verify that as well. So when we're pushing for an enforcement due to fraudulent activity, we have to be able to prove that that activity is actually occurring. Traditional phishing sites are the easiest because that intent is generally really clear. However, for email-based scams, malware, phishing, etc., we have to prove fraud by providing email headers from the original fraudulent email or malware data with an explanation, or for phishing, with the phone number attacks. The telco has to be able to call and verify that the number is collecting personal information. So I think, Dustin, at this point, why don't you take us through the brand enforcement process for brand infringements?
Okay. So there's many different methods to enforce on a site, and every single one of them depends on the type of infringement. So in most cases, though, there's multiple ways that can be employed, but done in an order from the simplest to the most difficult. So trademark in the domain requires a cease and desist letter to the registrant. Now, these letters aren't always effective, though. So when a domain is valuable enough to the trademark owner and the registrant will not drop or transfer the domain, the next option would be to use UDRP or the URS process. What's making things really difficult now, though, is GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation. If you haven't heard about this, and quite frankly, I don't know very many people who haven't, it's a regulation in the European Union law which restricts the use of personal data for all those in the EU and the EU economic area. This makes data, the who is data, a whole lot more difficult to obtain in many cases. We utilize different methods, though, to contact a registrant, but who is data is protected quite a bit today. When we find the who is data that's not accurate, we can file an ICANN invalid who is report, which then in turn requires the registrant to have the registrar actually, have the registrant fix the data, or they'll suspend the domain. Invalid who is a great way to ensure a quick response. Now, with pay-per-click sites, as long as you can find out who the advertiser is, you will probably be able to have the ads removed, which in turn prevents the registrant monetizing on the domain, on that trademark. Many ad providers are easy to work with and will remove the ads within a short period of time. At MarkMonitor, we refer to this process as pay-per-click graveyarding. So when there's infringing content on a site and a registrant won't remove it, we can send a letter to the ISP. ISPs are pretty good about removing content when there's a trademark violation, though there are some ISPs that reside in certain countries that they actually won't take action based on trademark infringement. So in many cases, we don't just rely on the one type of enforcement for a domain. Quite frankly, there's multiple ways to remove infringements. For example, if we have a site that has a trademark in the domain and pay-per-click ads, we could send both a cease and desist to the registrant for the domain and then also send a letter to the ad provider asking them to remove the ads. With this two-prong approach, we frequently get good response and good compliance as well. So, Steph, what do you do on the fraud side?
On the fraud side, it's pretty straightforward. ISPs are responsible for fraudulent content on their network, so we generally just notify them when we have customers that have found a site that is targeting their brand, that's hosting phishing content. We provide the ISP the URL and the IP address and then simply just ask them to remove it. We do not need the brand owner themselves to send a letter or to weigh in and indicate that they're not affiliated with the site. The ISP can actually verify that on their own when it's fraud. If there's any confusion on whether a site is legit or affiliated with the brand, then the ISP will not take action, and that's when we go back to your side, Dustin, and do the brand enforcement. So I have a couple examples here of some enforcement. So we both have a brand and a fraud enforcement. If you look on the right side, that's the fraud piece. It's very straightforward in requesting the ISP to remove the content. The notification actually comes from MarkMonitor, not from the brand owner. We'll also contact the domain owner for established domain registrations or a registrar for new registrations. And we can escalate to the country cert if the ISP is uncooperative as well. And then I have yours here up here, Dustin, to talk about the brand C&D.
Okay, so on the left, you will see some sample language that we've used in the past to have success in removing content from various sites. Now, it's important to know what information is required for each type of enforcement, because if you don't have the correct information, it will significantly slow the enforcement process. Most likely, you'll also have registrars pushing back on you, and it's really a lot more challenging. Also, not every enforcement uses the same language in the letter. A letter to graveyard the ads is going to be much different than a letter to the registrant letting them know they're violating a trademark and to cease and desist using it.
Excellent. Thank you, Dustin. So I think, let's recap what we've reviewed. We've talked about the importance of determining intent when evaluating an infringement. Intent can help us understand if we should utilize a fraud enforcement, which can generally come down more quickly since it's criminal. And the MarkMonitor SOC has about a 6 to 10 hour median shutdown time for phishing sites. So if it's fraud, that's going to be an effective method. Throw it over the fence to the SOC, get that taken down. But without proof of fraud, like a form accepting user credentials, then a brand infringement enforcement is likely the best enforcement method. So I think enforcement is largely dependent on the type of infringement, and it could take several steps. I think that was everything that we really wanted to cover today. Dustin, am I forgetting anything?
No, I believe you're right, Steph.
Okay, great. I hope this information has helped to understand how to strategize enforcement actions to both improve time and, your efficiency when processing infringements. I think we'd be happy to take some questions now. Brian, can you help us out? Did we get any questions come in?
You sure did. So thank you, Stephanie and Dustin, for a great presentation. As promised, we will take the next 10 minutes to answer your questions. If you have a question for either Stephanie or Dustin, please type them into the Q&A or chat windows, which are available in the bottom of the WebEx platform. Also, please be reminded if we do not get to your question during today's Q&A session, we will be sure to follow up with you afterward. So our first question is for Dustin. Dustin, how long does it typically take when you enforce on a trademarked domain for it to come down?
So that's a good question because it depends on the type of enforcement or the type of infringement and the registrar and the registrant. So typically we see it takes a little bit longer than, for example, a phishing site would take because of the fact that we have to go to the registrant and ask the registrant specifically to cease and desist using that domain. However, in many cases, we don't get a response or the registrant will respond in some cases favorably, some cases it's not quite favorably. But typically, we see a good response depending on the infringement or the type of enforcement we've sent is usually 4 to 6 weeks is, in many cases, the average time it takes.
Okay, excellent. Next question is for Stefanie. The attendee says, my company receives spear phishing attacks, or BEC scams, as you called them. What's the best way to action those? Is there anything the person can do proactively?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's absolutely a few different things that you can do. So oftentimes BEC scams are sent from domain names that have been registered to look like the legitimate brand. I just call them look-alike domains. I think people call them cousin domains. There's different terms for that. One of the things that you can do is track and see when those look-alike domains are being registered, so you can see when something is confusingly similar to your brand. I'll just pick on MarkMonitor because that's where we work, right? So if it's MarkMonitor customer.com or MarkMonitoremployees.com was registered, and then they started sending emails to your employees the next day, you would be aware that that domain was registered if you were monitoring new registrations, and you could do a couple of different things. At your spam filter, you could either block any emails coming in from those newly registered domains. You just have to pop them in every day. Or you can actually, and this is probably what I recommend, is having any emails coming in from those new domains rerouted to IT security to review the content first. That way it doesn't get delivered to the employee it was intended to get delivered to, who may or may not realize that it's fraudulent. Because if you look at it this way, if somebody registers a look-alike domain to your brand on, say, a Monday, there's no legitimate reason they should be emailing your employees the next day. So I think watching for those emails to come into your gateway, watching for those domains is a good way to kind of stay on top of that. The second part, of course, would be educating your employees to look for those types of emails. You know, if it feels off, if it feels funny, then it probably is. If the English isn't good, it's probably wrong. Oftentimes BEC scams have the appearance of coming from a mobile device, which is supposed to sort of like forgive any typos and things like that, and so you make accounts, you know, you think it's okay because it's coming from a mobile device and somebody's written it fast and they've made typos, when really you're not really looking at where it's coming from. And, you know, look at that email address, verify if it's legitimately coming from your CEO, and instead of hitting reply, hit forward and type in your CEO's address, you know, your actual address, and say, hey, did you send this to me? I just wanted to verify that this is legitimate. You know, have some checks and balances and basic skepticism when you're looking at email.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions. I think they're kind of in the same territory here. So the first question is, how do you deal with countries like Iran that don't seem to recognize copyrights? And then a similar question, what works best for offshore counterfeit product sellers selling using social advertising and or product images, but where it's difficult to track down the actual infringing party? Could you address those?
So in many of those cases, when it's difficult to track down those, as we know, who has information for the CCTLDs is a lot more challenging to come across because it's a law based in their country that they're going to publish that information or not. So what we do is we work a little bit closer with the registrars, and any of those relationships we built with those registrars, try to get them to forward the cease and desist letter to the registrant to get that into their hands. If it's content related, we can still go after the content via the ISP. However, when we're looking at a domain, in many cases we do our best to get the letter to the registrant if we have an email address, obviously, but if we don't have that contact information, you work with the registrar to get that to them. In many cases also, though, it's depending on where they are and what law applies to them, you know, we'll go after other methods. You know, like if it's the United States, it's UDRP, but that's the hard part about it with the CCTLDs, is just simply trying to get that letter to the registrant. But we work with the registrars, as I said. So.
Okay. And similar, we're seeing a lot on the chat regarding toll-free numbers. The questions we have specifically are, to whom do you send the fraud enforcement request for toll-free numbers? And a separate question, for brand impersonations online that give a toll-free number, what law are you invoking to request the shutdown? And more importantly, what agency do you ask to do so?
Okay, well, I'm not going to quote any laws here. I don't have that information in front of me, first of all. Second, when it comes to any sort of phone number, we're identifying the responsible telephone company for that number. I know that we have taken down toll-free numbers before. I would have to look and see what those responsible telcos were, and oftentimes I know that those different data sets or phone number subsets are sold and resold and actually operated by different companies. We really just generally trace that back to whoever's responsible, and then when they can verify that that phone number is collecting information, then they will generally take action. It does take a little bit longer in those instances because we're having to do a bunch of research, investigate who's responsible, and make a lot of phone calls and figure out who to go to on this. And then generally speaking, once they can determine that we've reached the correct responsible party that has responsibility for it, they will generally take action.
Okay. Have you had any success or experience dealing with infringement listings on marketplaces such as eBay or Amazon?
Infringement listings, like as far as we have good success on various marketplaces. Some of them are more challenging to work with due to their policies and procedures, or their terms and conditions as well. However, like on eBay, they're very responsive to us, to MarkMonitor. We have a variety of different infringements that we can take down with them. So we have good success. We constantly are adding more marketplaces to our lineup of the marketplaces that we do enforce upon as well. So our number of marketplaces that we can take action on is actually getting quite a bit bigger now. And with those, we vet them enough that we can actually have good success on them as well. And there's also things that constantly are evolving, so we're finding different ways to work with these marketplaces as well and building those relationships so that we can have better success and more compliance on those. So yes, the answer to that question would be that we have had good success on a lot of those marketplaces with getting infringements down, especially in the counterfeit world. So.
Super. So a question coming in, what kind of interaction is common between MarkMonitor and a customer's in-house or outside legal team?
So that one would be dependent on our client contact. So in many cases, we know that a client has their legal team. There's certain things that we ask our client contact to run through the trademark or the counsel as well, and have them look at different things that we need to have them approve before we can actually take action. So the client contact is the one that we more go through for legal counsel, I guess, if they need to have legal counsel, I should say, not for us to have legal counsel, but for them to have legal counsel. Typically, we also had some clients that are actually the legal counsel on their team as well. So the interaction between us and the legal departments is just simply that. It's just if it's not the actual contact, we go through the contact and then they look at the legal counsel or talk to the legal counsel. But if it's something that if we're dealing with the legal counsel directly, then we can just go ahead and ask them the questions. The interaction isn't much different than if we just talk with the client contact itself. So.
Okay, and this one would be for you, Dustin. What if you can't determine the intent of a site?
So if you can't determine the intent, what we end up doing is, in many cases, we need to find out if the client has an affiliation with that site. We still employ some of the similar methods that we would on other different types of infringements. That means that we would go to the registrant if it's a trademark infringement, or if it's in the domain, I should say, or we go to the ISP if it's a content infringement. So if we can't determine the intent, it's something that we would have the client verify it first before we take action on that. Typically, our workflows actually include us going to the client first anyway on website types of infringements and social media, those different things, to make sure that we can take action on those and that they're not known to the client first. And then we'll go ahead and go after them after that. But if we can't determine the intent, we still follow a lot of the same procedures that we would have normally on various other different types of sites.
And I would add to that on the fraud side, obviously to determine intent, we want to see if there's fraudulent activity where they're stealing credentials. And again, if they're not doing something that is criminally fraudulent that we can prove or the ISP can see themselves when they evaluate, then we have to send it over to the brand side, because it's going to have a trademark on it if it's impersonating a brand, but if there's no login or there's no place, and if there is a login and we try to put fake data in there or something like that, if we can't prove that it's fraudulent to the point where the ISP can see that as well, then the best enforcement is going to be on the brand side.
Okay, very good. Our last question for today, what do you suggest a brand owner can do to obtain WHOIS information with a GDPR-protected domain?
So that MarkMonitor, that's a challenging question. So ICANN has a temporary specification that requires a registrar to help trademark infringements, like help them to get the WHOIS information or pass them on. They provide a way to contact the registrant is what it says. So whether that means through a link on the site, through a contents, like a form on the site, or even an anonymous email address, that kind of stuff, they can do any of those things to contact the registrant. In the situation when we need to contact a registrant and none of those things are available, a lot of times what we'll do is we have built relationships with our registrars with the registrars that we work with, and we will go out and work with them on the best way possible for them to get the registrant the letter that we have. And then that's about the best way we can do it. Not the best way. That's one of the ways that we go about doing it. It's very challenging though now, trying to find the information that we need. But if we can't find it, then we'll usually reach out to the registrar, our contact there, and see what we can do as far as getting the letter to the registrant.
Excellent. Any final thoughts from either you, Stefanie, or Dustin?
No, I think we covered everything. Oh, I did want to add on the question I had on BEC scams. I talked about the proactive approach. The second part of that would be if the IT security group does get that phishing email, that spear phishing or BEC scam, with that original email, then it can be enforced upon. That would be the second part of that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, Stefanie and Dustin. Great presentation today, very informative. Folks, if you'd like more information, both Stefanie and Dustin have listed their contact information on the final slide. Please feel free to follow up with them. And of course, always, if you have a question, feel free to visit the MarkMonitor site. With that said, we'd like to thank everyone for joining our webinar, Brand and Anti-Fraud Enforcement Strategies. Please take a few minutes to complete our brief survey, which will automatically appear as you exit the webinar. And with that, we will end our presentation and wish everyone a great day. Goodbye.